The courtroom was already full before the old janitor stepped in, yet somehow it felt emptier the moment he appeared. He moved slowly toward the witness stand, each step careful, as if the polished floor itself demanded respect he wasn't sure he deserved. His uniform looked slightly too large on his thin frame, faded at the elbows and worn at the cuffs. The kind of clothing that had seen years of early mornings, late nights, and silent work that no one ever paused to acknowledge. His hands trembled, not dramatically, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Most people weren't. From the moment he entered, a few quiet smirks passed through the benches. Not loud enough to be called disrespectful in a courtroom, but sharp enough to sting if you were the one receiving them. He noticed them anyway. He always noticed things like that. Small expressions, subtle changes in tone, the way people avoided looking directly at those they didn't value. He had spent decades in places like this building without ever truly being seen inside it. Hallways, offices, conference rooms after hours. He had cleaned them all, listened to fragments of conversations that were never meant for him, and learned early on that silence was safer than attention. People like him were not expected to speak in rooms like this. People like him were expected to remain background details like furniture or lighting. And yet here he was. The clerk guided him to the stand, and when he placed his hand on the wooden rail to steady himself, the wood felt colder than he expected. Or maybe it was just him. The judge glanced over him briefly, already flipping through papers, as though his presence was procedural rather than meaningful. The attorneys adjusted their seats, preparing for what they clearly assumed would be an unimportant testimony. "State your name," came the voice. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't used to being asked for it in a place where it mattered. He spoke it softly. It barely carried. A faint chuckle came from somewhere behind him. Not directed enough to be punished, just careless enough to exist. He swallowed, steadying himself. His eyes drifted across the courtroom without meaning to linger anywhere in particular. He saw expensive suits, polished confidence, and expressions that suggested decisions had already been made long before he arrived. It reminded him of other rooms, boardrooms after midnight, offices where lights stayed on too late, where voices dropped whenever he entered with a mop and bucket. He wasn't supposed to be part of conversations like this. Not then. Not ever. But something had happened that changed the shape of things. When he was asked to begin, his voice came out rough at first, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. He cleared his throat gently, as if apologizing for taking up space. Then he began to speak. He talked about nights when the building was supposed to be empty but wasn't, about lights still glowing behind closed doors, about the sound of hurried footsteps in carpeted hallways that were usually silent after 7. He described moments most people would dismiss as insignificant, folders being moved when no meetings were scheduled, voices lowered when they thought no one was nearby. As he spoke, he didn't realize the room had started listening less out of interest and more out of curiosity. Not belief yet, just curiosity. A few people exchanged glances. One attorney leaned back slightly, as though physically distancing himself from the story being told. Another scribbled something that looked less like notes and more like skepticism on paper. The old man's voice grew steadier as he continued. Not stronger, just more certain. Like someone walking through a memory they had replayed too many times not to be sure of it anymore. Still, the atmosphere didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. Because people weren't used to truth arriving in a voice like his. Slow, weathered, unpolished. A voice that didn't know how to sound important, even when it was saying something important. And in that room full of certainty and status, that alone was enough to make him seem out of place. But he kept speaking anyway. The room shifted in the smallest ways, the kind of movement most people wouldn't notice unless they were trained to look for it. A chair creaked a little too loudly. Someone sighed as if already bored. Papers were adjusted, not because they were needed, but because hands wanted something to do while waiting for the real part of the trial to begin. The old janitor was still standing there in memory, even though he had already started speaking. Again. That was the strange part. His presence lingered in a way that didn't match how people were treating him. The case itself had weight. Everyone knew that much. A powerful company. Serious accusations. Names that didn't belong in normal conversations. Lawyers who looked like they had never lost anything in their lives. Everything about the room suggested the outcome had already been quietly decided somewhere far away from this courtroom. And the janitor, he didn't fit into that picture at all. He continued speaking, carefully choosing words as if each one had to survive inspection before being released. He described late-night routines that no one should have paid attention to. Hallways after midnight, elevators moving when they shouldn't have been in use, doors opening and closing with a strange urgency that didn't belong to normal work. Hours. At first, the defense table barely reacted. Then it started. A slight smile from one lawyer. A whisper exchanged behind a hand. Not loud enough to interrupt, just loud enough to dismiss. The kind of dismissal that doesn't need permission, because it believes itself justified. When the judge looked up again, it wasn't curiosity in the eyes, it was patience thinning. "Please stay relevant," came the calm instruction. The janitor nodded immediately. Too quickly, almost apologetically, as if he had done something wrong by existing in detail. He tried to adjust, but relevance was not something he was used to. His life had never required him to summarize truth into something convenient. He only knew what he had seen, and what he had seen didn't come in clean, simplified versions. Still, he continued. He mentioned names he wasn't sure he should know. Not confidently, carefully, like someone touching a hot surface to confirm. It was real. That was when the first real shift happened in the room. Not belief, not yet, but discomfort. One of the attorneys leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Another stopped writing entirely, because the names he spoke were not supposed to be part of his world. A faint ripple of laughter tried to return to the room, but it didn't land, the same way this time. It came out thinner, less certain, like a reflex that had lost its strength. The janitor noticed that too. He always noticed when laughter changed, and for the first time since he began speaking, he paused. Not because he had forgotten what to say, but because he could feel the room deciding what he was allowed to mean. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was controlled, like everyone was holding it in place until they understood whether this man was a mistake or a threat. The old janitor adjusted his grip on the stand. His fingers were still trembling, but his voice didn't break when he spoke again. It had changed slightly now, not stronger, but more careful, like he had started measuring the room instead of just remembering it. He described something small. Too small at first glance to matter. A detail about timing. A folder that wasn't supposed to be accessed after hours. A meeting that officially never existed. He didn't present it like evidence. He presented it like memory, uneasy, unpolished, but exact in the way only lived experience can be. That's when the first real shift in attention happened. A young clerk at the side table stopped moving, pen frozen above paper, eyes lifting, slowly, as if trying to match what was being said with something already stored in the court records. The connection wasn't immediate, but it was forming, quietly, dangerously. Across the room, one of the defense attorneys exhaled through his nose, a controlled reaction that tried to pass as disbelief, but carried something else underneath it. Concern. The judge's gaze lifted again, sharper this time, not patient anymore, measuring. "Repeat that detail," the judge said. The janitor hesitated. Not because he doubted himself, but because being asked to repeat something made it feel heavier, like it was suddenly being placed under a spotlight it was never meant to survive. He repeated it anyway, and this time the room didn't laugh. It didn't interrupt. It didn't move. Because now, the detail wasn't just a story anymore. It was starting to look like something that could be checked, verified, matched against things that should not have been visible to someone like him. And for the first time since he stepped into that courtroom, the silence didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like attention. The change was subtle, but once it happened, it was impossible to unsee. The young clerk quietly pulled a file closer, pretending it was routine work, but his eyes kept drifting back to the witness stand. Whatever the janitor had just repeated was no longer just a claim. It had started to resemble something already recorded somewhere else, something sealed, something not meant to be casually connected in open court. The old man noticed none of this directly. He only felt the shift in atmosphere. The laughter was gone now. So were the careless glances. In their place was a kind of alert stillness, the kind that arrives when people realize they may have missed something important. He continued speaking, slower now, as if walking carefully through fragile ground. Another detail came out, this time even smaller than the last. A timestamp. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a number. But numbers that don't belong to imagination. They belong to records. At the defense table, a pen stopped moving. One of the attorneys leaned back, expression tightening, no longer relaxed in his confidence. The earlier smirk had vanished completely, replaced by a controlled focus that didn't match the tone of dismissal from before. The judge didn't interrupt this time. Instead, there was a pause, long enough for the room to start filling in its own doubts. The janitor's voice wavered for a moment, not from fear, but from the weight of being taken seriously after so long. It was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people listening like this. Then he added one more detail, quieter than the rest. A name tied to a meeting that officially didn't exist. That was when the room truly changed. No one laughed. No one moved. Even the air felt heavier, like the courtroom itself had started paying attention for the first time. The tension didn't explode, it tightened. The defense team shifted into a different mode. No more quiet jokes, no more dismissive smiles. Now there was focus, sharp and calculated, like a door quietly locking from the inside. The old janitor was still standing where he had been for what felt like hours. His voice was starting to wear down, but not his memory. Every answer came slowly, carefully, as if he was afraid that speaking too fast might break something important. Then the questioning changed. It became sharper, more controlled. Designed to trip him, not to understand him. Dates were challenged. Names were repeated back with doubt. Small contradictions were searched for like cracks in glass. The intention was clear. If his story couldn't be destroyed, it could at least be confused. He struggled under it. Not because he was lying, but because he was old, and pressure like this wasn't something he had ever been trained to survive. His hands tightened on the stand again, knuckles pale. For a moment he looked like he might stop, but then something steadied him. Not confidence, not strength, memory. He corrected one detail calmly, then another. Not aggressively, just firmly enough to show he wasn't guessing. Each correction made the room slightly quieter, slightly less certain of itself. One lawyer finally leaned forward, voice cold. "So you're saying you alone saw all this?" The question hung there, heavy and pointed. The janitor didn't answer immediately, because the truth was simple and that was the problem. Yes, he had seen it, but saying it out loud made it sound impossible. And in that hesitation, the courtroom decided to hold its breath again. The hesitation in the old janitor's voice lingered longer than anyone expected. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he could feel the room trying to decide whether he was worth believing at all. The defense attorney pressed again, slower this time, almost satisfied with the discomfort. "You expect this court to accept that you alone noticed all of this?" A pause followed. He looked down briefly as if searching the floor for the right way to explain something that never had a simple shape. His life had never been about being believed. It had been about being ignored. And suddenly, being heard felt heavier than silence ever did. Before he could answer, something shifted at the back of the courtroom. A door opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to break the rhythm of control that had settled over the room. Heads turned. At first, no one understood why the energy changed. Then recognition started spreading, slow, uncertain, like a ripple that didn't yet know its own importance. Keanu Reeves stepped inside. There was no flash, no interruption, no theatrical pause. He didn't walk like someone expecting attention. He walked like someone who had come because something mattered. The courtroom didn't speak. Even the lawyers stopped moving. He didn't take a seat immediately. His eyes moved across the room, not searching for spectacle, but for understanding. When they finally settled on the old janitor, the expression in his face changed, not into sympathy, but recognition of something deeper. The judge adjusted slightly in his chair, unsure how to categorize the presence in front of him. A murmur. Started somewhere but died quickly, as if the room itself had decided it wasn't allowed. Keanu didn't speak yet. He simply stood there, still, looking at the man who had been dismissed so easily only moments ago. And in that silence, the balance of the courtroom began to tilt without a single word being spoken. The silence that followed his entrance didn't feel empty anymore. It felt suspended, like the entire courtroom was waiting for permission to breathe again. Keanu Reeves finally stepped forward, not toward the judge, not toward the lawyers, but toward the space where the truth had been quietly struggling to survive. He didn't start with emotion, he started with calm. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it carried cleanly through the room, cutting through the tension without raising it. He didn't defend the old janitor in the way people expected. Instead, he questioned something deeper, the way the room had already decided what kind of voice was worth listening to. He looked at the attorneys, then briefly at the judge. "Does truth change depending on who says it?" he asked. No one answered. The question wasn't legal. It wasn't procedural. It was uncomfortable because it was simple. The janitor stood, frozen behind him, watching someone speak in a way he never had the chance to. Keanu continued, slightly turning toward the witness stand. "He didn't arrive here with status. He arrived here with observation, and observation doesn't care about titles." A shift happened again, but this time it wasn't suspicion. It was reflection. One of the younger court staff lowered their gaze, like something had finally clicked that shouldn't have taken so long. Even the defense table lost some of its sharpness, not because they were convinced, but because they were no longer fully comfortable. The judge leaned back slightly, expression unreadable now. Not dismissive, not approving, just reconsidering. Keanu didn't raise his voice at any point. He didn't need to. And when he finished speaking, the room didn't return to how it was before. Because now the janitor wasn't being treated like a mistake anymore. He was being treated like a possibility. The judge ordered a quiet review of the details mentioned, almost reluctantly at first, as if still unsure whether this line of testimony deserved the weight it was beginning to gather. But truth has a way of forcing attention once the smallest piece is verified. At the side table, the young clerk returned with a document file that had been cross-checked twice. His expression was different now, no longer skeptical, but unsettled. He placed it down carefully, like it might disturb the air in the room. The first matching detail was confirmed, then another, then the timestamp the old janitor had mentioned earlier. Each confirmation didn't arrive like a dramatic reveal. It arrived like a quiet collapse of certainty. The defense team tried to regain control, but their confidence had already started to fracture. Questions became shorter. Statements became slower. The rhythm they once owned no longer responded to them. The old janitor stood motionless, almost afraid to breathe too deeply, as if movement might erase what was happening. He had spent so many years being wrong in other people's eyes that being correct felt unfamiliar, even dangerous. Then the deeper layer surfaced. A sealed internal audit file was opened under court authorization. It revealed discrepancies, meetings that were logged but never officially recorded, document transfers that didn't align with legal procedures, and a hidden chain of approvals that pointed toward deliberate manipulation. It wasn't just one mistake. It was structured, intentional, long-term. The courtroom shifted in a way that had nothing to do with movement and everything to do with realization. The case was no longer about whether the janitor was credible. It had become about how much of what he saw had actually been hidden in plain sight. Keanu Reeves remained still as the findings were read aloud. He didn't react with satisfaction or surprise. His expression stayed grounded, as if the outcome confirmed something he had already suspected about how easily people overlook those without power. The judge finally spoke, voice lower now. This court will reopen the investigation based on verified inconsistencies. A silence followed, not the kind that dismisses, but the kind that absorbs. The janitor slowly lowered his head, not in defeat, but in something closer to relief. For years, he had carried fragments of moments no one believed mattered. Now those fragments were no longer isolated. They were connected, recognized. As the courtroom began to empty in quiet confusion, Keanu stepped closer to the witness stand. He didn't say anything grand. He simply looked at the old man and gave a small nod, one that carried more acknowledgement than any speech could. The janitor didn't respond with words. He couldn't, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't being measured by what people assumed he was. He was being understood by what he actually saw, and that changed everything.